Edward Sterling had constructed his existence around the principle of control. Each choice, each investment, each meticulously planned step had brought him to a level of success that surpassed all expectations. He was a master of the game, fully aware of the dynamics of influence and maneuvering through them with unmatched skill. Yet, in a heartbeat, everything fell apart the moment he laid eyes on her. In the lobby of an exclusive resort, he found himself gripping the hand of a little girl with striking blue eyes. There, unexpectedly, stood Clara, his ex-wife, a figure from his past he never anticipated encountering again. What about the child? She was at the perfect age. The similarity was undeniable. A chilling awareness took root in his chest. Was Clara concealing a secret from him all this time? Had he inadvertently strolled by his own daughter, completely unaware of her existence? Edward Sterling was not the type to dwell on the past. His whole existence revolved around progress, making choices without a moment's pause, and always having a clear vision of what lay ahead. He devoted years to mastering the craft of control, building an empire through unwavering determination and discipline. To those looking in, he seemed to possess it all, a thriving multi-million-dollar enterprise, authority, sway, and the knack for entering any space and garnering admiration. As he lounged in the opulent lobby of the seaside resort, cradling a glass of whiskey and allowing the soft murmur of conversation to envelop him, an unusual sensation began to settle in, the strange burden of fatigue. He arrived with the facade of seeking a rare respite, yet deep down, he was acutely aware of his own tendencies, already preoccupied with the meetings awaiting his return, the deals poised for completion, and the phone calls that lingered on his to-do list. He was not particularly skilled at unwinding. He savored another sip, releasing a slow breath as his eyes drifted toward the entrance. It was at that moment he caught sight of her. Initially, he believed his imagination was deceiving him. The figure that emerged from the revolving door bore an uncanny resemblance to a specter from his history, a person he had assured himself he would never encounter once more. She glided with a serene elegance, her dark brown hair flowing over her shoulders as she gently shifted the small child in her embrace. The vision stirred a profound tension within him. Clara. For a brief instant, he simply gazed, struggling to comprehend the scene before him. She appeared nearly unchanged from 3 years prior, still beautiful and poised, yet now carrying a subtle layer of fatigue in her expression. Nothing could have prepared me for the surprise of finding her here, especially with the child she was holding. A tiny girl, perhaps just 3 years old, clung to Clara's neck, her face nestled into her mother's shoulder. Edward sensed his fingers clenching the glass more firmly. His heartbeat, once steady and controlled, now thudded with an inexplicable urgency. He had not laid eyes on Clara since their marriage came to a close. Their divorce unfolded with a serene simplicity, devoid of any theatrical courtroom confrontations or unresolved disputes. She had departed, and he had allowed her to leave, convincing himself it was for the greater good. He immersed himself in his tasks, firmly believing that what they had once experienced was merely a fleeting diversion. He had progressed forward. Or at least, that was the narrative he had consistently spun for himself. But witnessing her now, with a child who appeared to be just a heartbeat away from the instant she had exited his life, a chill lodged itself in his gut. Could this be her daughter? And if that were the case, why did he feel a nauseating certainty that he was already aware of the answer? Clara approached the reception desk, adjusting the child in her arms as she engaged with the hotel staff. Edward hardly took note of anything else in the room. The surrounding voices diminished, the music emanating gently from the speakers turned into mere background murmur. His attention was drawn solely to the unmistakable resemblance of the little girl's features, even from afar. A keen sense of urgency enveloped him, an instinct he had never truly experienced before. He felt compelled to have a conversation with her. Seeking clarity. Yet, before he could take a step, before he could summon the strength to rise, Clara was already making her way to the elevator, cradling the child tightly as she vanished behind the sliding doors. Edward stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the void left behind in her absence. The meticulously crafted existence he had established for himself had never seemed more precarious. Edward hardly found rest that night. Despite his efforts to banish the vision of Clara and the little girl from his thoughts, it persisted, insisting on his focus. He dedicated years to mastering the skill of compartmentalization, ensuring his emotions remained hidden in pursuit of logic and control. Yet this evening, his thoughts were a tumultuous clash of inquiries, each one devoid of resolution. Did the child belong to her? It was clear as day. The girl's grip on her was unwavering, and Clara's embrace was filled with a fierce protectiveness that made everything clear. Yet the true inquiry, the one that lingered in his mind, was the one he doubted he was prepared to confront. Did she belong to him? A peculiar sense of panic washed over him, an unfamiliar sensation he had never experienced before. Why had Clara never mentioned that she had a child, his child? Did she genuinely think he was unworthy of knowing? Or worse, had she believed he wouldn't be affected? As the initial rays of sunlight began to seep through the expansive windows of his suite, Edward had reached a conclusion. He refused to waste another moment caught up in uncertainty. He sought the truth, and he was determined to uncover it. Following a swift shower and a change into one of his meticulously tailored suits, as he believed that maintaining control was essential in any circumstance, he made his way downstairs. He was uncertain whether Clara remained at the hotel, yet an instinct deep within him suggested she was still there. She would never have ventured to a place like this for merely one night. As he entered the restaurant, he surveyed the room with a keen eye. The resort was designed for the affluent, those individuals who effortlessly indulged in midweek getaways without a moment's hesitation. However, Edward had no intention of seeking them out. His gaze fell upon a quaint table by the terrace, where Clara was seated with the young girl at her side. His heart raced at the sight of them together in the daylight. Clara appeared as breathtaking as ever, her dark brown hair gathered in a relaxed ponytail, exuding a sense of effortless grace in her demeanor. The child, Lily, if he recalled correctly from the name the receptionist had mentioned the previous night, sat quietly, swinging her small legs beneath the table as she nibbled on a piece of toast. It was the first moment Edward had genuinely observed her, and the sight sent a tight knot into his stomach. Her eyes were a striking shade of blue. Those striking blue eyes. It was undeniable at this point. Drawing in a calming breath, he advanced, approaching their table with determination. Clara observed him even before he uttered a word. Her body stiffened at once, her fingers gripping her coffee cup tightly. She cast a fleeting look at Lily before shifting her gaze back to him, her face a mask of ambiguity. "We need to discuss this," Edward said, maintaining a calm and measured tone. Clara paused, casting another look at Lily before giving a slight nod. "Not here," she whispered. "Let's rendezvous outside in 15 minutes. Edward gave a slight nod before turning on his heel and walking away, choosing to avoid any unnecessary drama. His pulse throbbed in his ears, emotions wound tightly just beneath the surface. 15 minutes later, he found himself by the serene garden terrace at the resort's edge, hands tucked into his pockets, gazing out at the vast ocean. The tumultuous waves offered no solace to the tempest brewing within him. Suddenly, footsteps echoed behind him. He glanced over to see Clara positioned there, arms folded, her demeanor cautious. Edward inhaled deeply, attempting to find his balance. "Does she belong to me?" Clara recoiled just a bit, her gaze igniting with an enigmatic spark. She let out a breath, glancing down briefly before locking eyes with him. "Indeed," she replied in a gentle tone. "She belongs to you." The ground appeared to shift beneath his feet. 3 years have passed. For 3 long years, he remained unaware. From this moment on, everything in his life would change forever. Edward remained motionless, grappling with the profound impact of Clara's words. Her words were delivered with such simplicity and quietness, yet the effect crashed over him like a tidal wave. Lily was his beloved daughter. His hands clenched in his pockets as he struggled to maintain a steady breath. 1,000 emotions clashed within him, shock, anger, disbelief, but beneath it all lay something deeper, something primal. He welcomed a new life into the world. And he had never even realized. Clara fidgeted, a palpable tension in the air as she braced herself for his response. Her arms remained crossed, a silent shield against whatever might unfold next. "Why didn't you share this with me?" His voice was soft, yet the sharpness in it was unmistakable. Clara let out a quick breath, massaging her forehead before locking eyes with him. "Things were not meant to unfold this way, Edward. I never intended to keep her from you, but by the time I discovered I was expecting, we were already drifting apart. Your focus on work left you feeling so far away. I was unsure of the best way to get in touch with you." His jaw clenched. "It seems you've made a choice on my behalf. You assumed I wouldn't be affected." Her eyes sparkled with a hint of exasperation. "I assumed you might feel a sense of duty. That you would avoid responsibility, not out of desire. I wanted to ensure that Lily never felt like she was a burden as she grew up." Edward released a sardonic chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Did you really believe that hiding her away was the wisest choice?" Clara stated with conviction, "I believed I was safeguarding her. Safeguarding our interests." The difficulty of that choice was beyond measure, yet in that moment, it seemed to be the sole path available to me. Edward dragged his hand across his face, seeking to steady himself. He had constructed his whole existence around reason, around mastery, around the art of deliberate choices. Yet, this was an unforeseen circumstance he had never anticipated. "She's 3, he finally murmured, his voice softer now. 3 years of her life, vanished. Time lost that can never be reclaimed." Clara's face softened, and for the first time, a hint of regret flickered in her expression. She acknowledged it. "I won't attempt to explain it away. But Edward, I never intended to separate her from you indefinitely." He cast a keen glance in her direction. "So, what stopped you from getting in touch?" Clara paused, letting out a slow breath. "I feared that if I acted, you might claim her for yourself." The words left him speechless. He gazed at her, attempting to grasp the meaning of her recent words. "I wouldn't have done that," he said, his voice strained. Clara locked eyes with him, her face a canvas of inscrutable emotions. "Would you not?" Edward gulped with difficulty. Truthfully, he found himself uncertain about what actions he might have taken in that moment. He had been unforgiving in his journey, unyielding in his quest for achievement. Would he have battled for custody? Would he have attempted to manage the situation as he managed every other aspect of his life? Perhaps Clara was onto something. Perhaps he wasn't the person she could rely on with something so delicate as a child. Yet he had transformed into someone entirely different. "I want to see her," he said finally, his voice unwavering. "I wish to deepen my understanding of my daughter." Clara studied his expression intently, contemplating the trustworthiness of his words. Then, gradually, she inclined her head in agreement. "Very well," she replied gently. "However, we proceed according to Lily's preferences. She is unfamiliar with you, Edward. One cannot simply enter her world and anticipate that all will align perfectly in an instant." He nodded, comprehension evident in his expression. He expressed that he doesn't anticipate that. "However, I have no intention of leaving this time." Clara observed him intently, and for the first time, he noticed a change in her expression. The fortified barriers still stood, yet a fissure had emerged, a slight aperture in their midst. "Then we begin at a gentle pace," she remarked. "Progress unfolds gradually." Edward nodded once more, his heart constricted by feelings he struggled to understand. For years, he had been convinced that he was alone, that the only mark he would leave on the world was the empire he had constructed. At that moment, he came to the unsettling realization that he had been mistaken all along. He was determined to do everything necessary to reclaim the time he had missed. Edward had always faced situations with unwavering confidence. He had orchestrated billion-dollar agreements, faced off in boardrooms with the most formidable executives, and maneuvered through crises that would have shattered those less resilient. As he lingered by the hotel's garden terrace, anticipation coursed through him while he awaited Clara's arrival with Lily, a strange sensation coiling within his chest. "How did you go about introducing yourself to a daughter who was unaware of your existence?" Clara had emphasized that this would unfold gradually, according to Lily's wishes. Edward grasped that concept. He didn't anticipate her to rush into his embrace or refer to him as Dad in an instant. Yet the gravity of the moment continued to bear heavily upon him. 3 years had already slipped away from him. He was determined not to squander another moment. The gentle patter of footsteps caught his attention, prompting him to turn. Clara approached him, her stance both taut and poised, her deep-set eyes a mystery. And next to her, gripping her hand firmly, was Lily. Edward felt a sudden tightness in his throat. She was diminutive, hardly coming up to Clara's waist. Her dark curls danced gently with each step, and those blue eyes, mirroring his own reflection each morning, sparkled with a serene curiosity. She grasped her mother's fingers tightly, uncertain of the unfamiliar circumstances that surrounded her. Clara knelt beside Lily and whispered gently. "Darling, it's Edward. He is a friend of mine." Edward experienced a sharp sensation at the mention of the word, friend, yet he remained composed. He grasped the reason behind Clara's words. Referring to him as her father directly could have felt too intense. Lily gazed at him, her head tilting ever so slightly, as though she were examining a riddle that eluded her understanding. She remained silent for a moment, simply gazing up at him with her remarkably large eyes. Edward lowered himself to her height, ensuring his actions were deliberate and gentle. "Greetings, Lily," he spoke softly. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Lily moved a bit, glancing at Clara as if seeking comfort. At her mother's nod, she found the courage to finally speak. "Hello." It was merely a single word, diminutive and hesitant, yet it caused a stir within Edward, tightening something deep inside him. He offered a warm smile, aiming to soothe her nerves. "I understand you have an affinity for puzzles. Is that really the case?" Lily's eyes sparkled with a glimmer of curiosity. She nodded with a measured deliberation. "I'm not particularly skilled at them," Edward confessed, maintaining a cheerful tone. "Perhaps you could share your knowledge with me at some point." Lily stole another look at Clara, as if seeking reassurance that this was acceptable. After a brief pause, she nodded again. Edward exhaled slowly, unaware that he had been holding his breath. It may have been small, yet it marked the beginning. Clara stood tall, her fingers gently gliding through Lily's curls. "How about we take a seat?" she proposed, guiding them to a shaded spot featuring a quaint table and chairs. Edward trailed behind, his thoughts still swirling in the wake of it all. He was blessed with a daughter. She sat directly across from him, toying with the hem of her dress and casting furtive, inquisitive looks in his direction. Clara delved into her bag and retrieved a petite coloring book along with a vibrant set of crayons, setting them down before Lily. "Feel free to add some color as we chat, all right?" Lily nodded, opening the book and thoughtfully choosing a blue crayon. Edward observed her intently for a moment before he spoke once more. "What color do you like the most?" Lily kept her gaze down, responding softly, "Purple." He grinned. "That's an excellent selection. The hue is quite bold." Lily stole another glance at him, allowing her gaze to linger for a heartbeat longer before returning to her book. Edward let out a breath, adjusting his position in the chair. He had anticipated discomfort, but now that he found himself in her presence, he understood the extent of the effort required from him. Clara seemed to have an intuition about his thoughts, as she gently broke the silence. She tends to be reserved in the presence of unfamiliar faces. Edward gave a slight nod. "That's perfectly fine. We'll move forward according to her rhythm. Lily immersed herself in her coloring, while Edward seized the opportunity to observe her closely. The delicate features, the way she bit her lip in concentration, the soft curl of her fingers as she gripped the crayon, it was surreal to consider that this little girl belonged to him. He had overlooked her initial steps, her first words, the small milestones that parents hold dear. However, he was determined not to let anything else slip by. After some time, Lily paused her coloring and glanced up at him. "What's your favorite color?" Edward beamed at the modest yet meaningful instance. He remarked, "I believe I understand now. Purple seems quite appealing." Lily regarded him for a moment, then nodded as if she found his response satisfactory. Clara observed the exchange, a gentle warmth spreading across her features. Edward understood that this was merely the start, yet for the first time in ages, he sensed he was precisely where he belonged. Edward experienced a peculiar sensation, as if time was both dragging and racing simultaneously. The days after his initial encounter with Lily unfolded like a tightrope walk, every exchange meticulously gauged, each instant laden with more significance than he had ever foreseen. He had forged his path through assertiveness, through seizing opportunities, through ensuring that events unfolded precisely as he envisioned. However, this was not a transaction. This was his beloved daughter. And there was no plan that could compensate for the time that had slipped away. He and Clara had established a cautious rhythm. Each morning, he gathered with them for breakfast at the hotel's restaurant, positioned across from Lily as she delicately nibbled her toast in measured bites. She remained timid in his presence, uncertain of his role in her life, yet she had started to open up to him. Initially, it was the little gestures, stealing glances at him as he spoke, offering nods in reply to his inquiries. She began sharing small snippets of her day, mentioning how she spotted a peculiar bird outside their hotel window and her dislike for the orange juice, which she found too sour. He clung to each word with unwavering attention. One afternoon, as he and Clara lounged on a shaded terrace, with Lily engrossed in her small set of toys at their feet, he finally mustered the courage to voice the question that had been eating away at him since the moment he uncovered the truth. "What brings you here, Clara?" She averted her gaze from him initially. She focused intently on Lily, observing as their daughter meticulously arranged small plastic cups into a tower. After a brief pause, she expressed that we required a respite. "Life at home has been challenging." Edward observed her closely, recognizing the tightness in her shoulders. He had been familiar with Clara to the extent that he could sense when she was concealing something. "How hard?" he pressed. Clara let out a soft sigh, finally directing her gaze toward him. "Lily has been inquiring. Concerning her father." Something within him contorted at that. "What did you say to her?" Clara paused, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Initially, I explained to her that families can take on various forms. Some children have both a mother and a father together, while others do not. However, she possesses great intelligence, Edward." She kept inquiring relentlessly. "She was curious to find out if you existed beyond the distance. If you had any inkling of her existence." Edward let out a breath, his gaze fixed on Lily, who remained absorbed in her tower. The realization that she had devoted her brief existence to pondering his presence, seeking answers that remained elusive, struck him with an unexpected heaviness in his heart. "So you brought her here," he murmured softly. Clara gave a slight nod. "I wasn't sure if our paths would cross, but there was a part of me that wished we would." Edward glanced back at her, his expression a mystery that eluded understanding. "Would you have ever shared that with me?" Clara swallowed, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair with a hint of tension. "I'm not sure," she confessed. "I had the desire to. I came close, countless times. Yet, fear gripped me." Edward hesitated, uncertain if he truly wanted to listen to her justifications. Yet, he was aware that it was necessary for him to do so. "What is there to fear?" Her gaze fell upon her hands. That you would despise me. That you would despise her, or that you would attempt to steal her from me. Edward experienced a sudden wave of remorse. He had devoted a significant portion of his life to the notion that control was synonymous with security, that power implied an absence of vulnerability. Had he truly transformed into the sort of man that Clara had dreaded would wield his power against her? "I would never have done that," he said, his voice unwavering. Clara gazed up at him, her deep eyes probing his. "I wish to hold on to that belief." For an extended silence, neither of them uttered a word. Years of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Then, Lily's tower fell apart with a soft clatter, and she released a tiny, disheartened sigh. Edward bent low, meticulously gathering the plastic cups and arranging them once more. "Would you like to give it another shot?" he inquired. Lily glanced at him momentarily before offering a subtle nod. She extended her hand, her tiny fingers lightly grazing his as she accepted the cup from him. It was an ordinary moment, yet for Edward, it held profound significance. Clara observed them, a gentle warmth spreading across her face. Perhaps her fears from that time were justified. Perhaps he wasn't quite prepared. Yet, he was prepared at this moment. He was determined not to squander another moment. Edward had always struggled with patience. His whole existence revolved around swift decisions, bold actions that allowed no space for doubt. He was a man who established ambitions and fulfilled them, who always ensured that time was acknowledged and valued. Yet, he was coming to understand that only through patience could he attain what was genuinely significant. Lily was slowly starting to place her trust in him, but it was unfolding in cautious, measured increments. She continued to seek Clara's reassurance whenever he spoke, still pausing before responding to his inquiries. Yet she was gradually allowing him to enter her world. She allowed him to take a seat next to her at breakfast, maintaining a distance from her mother. She allowed him to assist her in selecting colors as she created in her sketchbook. She allowed him to hold the door open for her, exuding a quiet confidence as she stepped through without hesitation. Though they were minor, Edward cherished them as triumphs. One afternoon, he stood outside the hotel's garden courtyard, observing as Lily knelt beside a row of flowers. She glided her fingers across the petals, whispering a soft incantation that eluded his ears. Clara sat on a bench nearby, allowing Lily her space while observing her with the gentle vigilance of a mother attuned to her child's every action. Edward approached with deliberate slowness, ensuring he didn't surprise Lily. "What are you up to?" he inquired, maintaining a cheerful tone. Lily cast a fleeting look in his direction before returning her gaze to the blossoms. She spoke to the bees with a straightforward demeanor. Edward lifted an eyebrow in curiosity. "Ah! What are they discussing?" Lily pressed her lips together, deep in contemplation. "They have a lot on their plates, which leaves little room for conversation. However, I believe they have an appreciation for the flowers." Edward knelt beside her, watching the delicate bees darting among the flowers. He had never paused to observe details like this before. His existence had perpetually been overwhelming, relentless in its pace. Yet, in this moment with his daughter, the idea of slowing down felt surprisingly appealing. "Are you fond of flowers?" he inquired. Lily gave a slight nod. "Mother claims they bring joy to others." Edward cast a sidelong look at Clara, who observed them while feigning disinterest. He glanced over his shoulder at Lily. "She is correct. Indeed, they do." Lily pondered this for a moment, then gestured towards a delicate, pale purple flower. "That one is my absolute favorite." Edward beamed. "I recall you mentioning your fondness for purple." Lily gazed at him, her expression one of astonishment, as though she had not anticipated him recalling such a minor detail. She remained silent, yet a subtle change flickered across her face, a gentler nuance emerging. Edward allowed the moment to linger between them, neither pressing nor hurrying. Eventually, Lily rose to her feet, brushing off her dress with a delicate touch. "I'm feeling quite hungry," she declared. Clara seized the moment to rise to her feet. She concurred, suggesting that we should head indoors. "Lunch is just around the corner." Edward paused briefly before he began to speak. "How about we share a meal together?" Clara glanced at Lily, her eyes seeking a response. Lily inclined her head, contemplating, then gave a nod of agreement. "Understood." It was a lukewarm affirmation, neither a resounding yes nor a definitive no. Edward viewed it as a step forward. As they entered together, a sense of calm washed over Edward for the first time since uncovering the truth. Perhaps he had transformed from a mere stranger into something more significant. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was beginning to evolve into something greater. Edward was starting to understand that trust was not a commodity he could simply command. It was a journey he needed to undertake, bit by bit, experience by experience. With Lily, each little triumph held significance. In the days that followed, their exchanges grew increasingly effortless. She retained her moments of silence, occasionally pausing before addressing him, yet the doubt in her gaze was diminishing. She released her grip on Clara when he was close by. She closed the gap between them, no longer hesitant about his presence. One morning, he entered the breakfast room to discover Lily already at their familiar table, a plate of pancakes awaiting her attention. Clara poured herself a cup of coffee, her demeanor reflecting a newfound sense of ease that had eluded her for days. Edward drew out his chair and settled in, observing as Lily meticulously drizzled syrup over her pancakes. "Are they worthwhile?" he inquired. Lily looked up at him, her mind working as she chewed, then gave a slow nod. "They seem satisfactory." Edward wore a sly grin. "Merely satisfactory." After a brief pause, she remarked that strawberries would enhance them significantly. Edward acknowledged with a solemn nod. "I'll keep that in mind for the future." Lily examined him closely, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. In silence, she nudged her plate a bit closer to him. "If you'd like, you're welcome to have some." Edward sensed a constriction in his chest. It was a seemingly small act, yet from her, it carried a significance that she may not have fully understood. He grasped his fork, slicing off a delicate morsel before savoring the taste. "It's not too shabby," he remarked. "However, I believe you have a valid point. Strawberries could enhance their quality." Lily offered a subtle, contented smile before turning her attention back to her breakfast. Clara, having observed the interaction in silence, cast Edward a knowing glance. It marked the first occasion where Lily had chosen to share something with him, and an unspoken understanding lingered between them. Following breakfast, they chose to stroll along the shore. The secluded shoreline of the resort was tranquil, with the waves softly caressing the sand. Lily meandered between them, her tiny hand sometimes stretching out to grasp Clara's as they ambled along. Edward observed her as she crouched to retrieve a seashell, examining it closely in her hands before lifting it for a better view. "This one is quite lovely," she remarked. Edward grasped it from her, scrutinizing it closely. "Indeed, it is. Are you fond of gathering shells?" Lily gave a slight nod. "Mom says they're like tiny echoes from the sea." Edward returned the shell to her with a gentle gesture. "In that case, it would be wise to hold on to it." Lily paused briefly, then deftly tucked it into the pocket of her dress. In an unexpected twist, she extended her hand and grasped his, leaving him utterly surprised. It was a brief, delicate connection, her tiny fingers encircling his for an instant before she released him and dashed forward, her laughter mingling with the splashes of water at her feet. Edward remained motionless, a profound change stirring within him. Clara, next to him, offered a gentle smile. She whispered that she's becoming accustomed to you. Edward exhaled gently, his gaze fixed on Lily as she twirled gracefully along the shoreline. He confessed that he believed he was starting to understand her as well. For the first time in his life, the allure of business, power, and success faded, revealing that they weren't the most significant pursuits after all. Indeed, she did. Edward had devoted his whole existence to the notion that success was quantified by figures. Profits, mergers, competitive positioning, these were the foundations upon which he had constructed his reality. As he stood on the beach, observing Lily gather seashells with an expression of sheer joy, he came to the realization that perhaps he had been mistaken all this time. The remainder of the afternoon unfolded in a manner that seemed almost dreamlike. As they strolled along the shoreline, Lily would dart ahead, her laughter mingling with the sound of the waves, only to return moments later, proudly displaying yet another hidden gem she had unearthed from the sand. With every glance, her eyes reflected a growing trust, as if she was gradually starting to accept that he would remain by her side. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they had gathered a modest assortment of shells, which Lily meticulously organized on the wooden deck beside the beach chairs. She settled into a cross-legged position, carefully examining each item before categorizing them into distinct groups. Edward observed, captivated by her unwavering concentration on something so seemingly trivial. Clara settled next to him, a gentle breeze tousling her dark hair as she shifted her gaze between them. She had never experienced this before, she murmured gently. Edward glanced at her, a crease forming on his forehead. "What did you have?" Clara paused, weighing her words with deliberation. "A paternal presence. A person who is fully engaged. Someone who gazes at her with the same intensity as you do." Edward felt a lump in his throat, uncertain of how to reply to such a statement. For years, he had persuaded himself that family was an unnecessary burden, that love and connections were mere distractions that would hinder his progress. Yet, as he gazed at Lily in that moment, a deep longing surged within him for all the fleeting instances that had slipped through his fingers. "I can't alter what has already happened," he finally said. "Yet, I find myself present in this moment. If you would permit me." Clara gazed at him, her expression a mystery that defied interpretation. "What occurs when we depart from this location?" Edward let out a breath, his fingers combing through his hair. He had also been pondering that. Their stay at the resort seemed like a secluded haven, a fleeting reprieve from the everyday world. Yet, he wished for this moment to linger even after they left their hotel rooms. He expressed a desire for permanence. "I desire to be a part of her life. I desire to be her father, not merely for a fleeting moment or as a vague presence in her life. Truly support her." Clara observed him intently for a prolonged moment before she finally spoke. "It signifies the importance of being present, Edward. Not merely when it suits you, not solely when it aligns with your timetable. She isn't a transaction to be bargained over. She is a young child in search of consistency, yearning for the assurance that those around her will remain steadfast." Edward nodded, his jaw clenched in determination. "I am aware of that. I am determined to show you that I am capable of achieving this. I can become what she requires." Clara examined his expression, and in that moment, he noticed the final remnants of her uncertainty disappear. "Then show me," she whispered. Before he had a chance to reply, Lily dashed towards them, clutching something firmly in her hands. "Look," she said, spreading her delicate fingers to unveil a tiny, flawlessly formed white shell. "This one holds a unique significance." Edward leaned in, carefully accepting the shell from her palm. "It's stunning," he remarked. "What makes it unique?" Lily inclined her head, deep in thought. "Since this is the final one I discovered today. It resembles a fortunate shell." Edward smiled, feeling a pang in his chest at the purity of her words. He suggested that we should hold on to it. Just a gentle reminder. Lily nodded with enthusiasm, then, without a moment's pause, she settled onto his lap, her head gently resting against his chest. Edward sensed a sudden tightness in his chest. It marked the first occasion she approached him independently, unprompted and without Clara's comforting presence. The gesture was quiet, yet it held profound significance. Clara observed them, and when Edward turned his gaze toward her, he noticed a change in her expression, something resembling acceptance. For the first time in his life, Edward Sterling sensed that he had truly discovered something precious to cling to. This time, he was determined not to let it slip away. The elegance of this conclusion resides in its subtlety, while still delivering a profoundly moving resolution. It's not about extravagant displays or theatrical pronouncements but rather something much deeper: dedication, faith, and the gradual restoration of connections. Edward Sterling starts this narrative as an individual who equates success with dominance and authority, convinced that emotional connections merely act as hindrances. Ultimately, he discovers that genuine success lies not in the achievements of the boardroom, but in the relationships he cultivates in his personal life. The evolution of Lily's feelings towards Edward is what imbues this journey with such strength. Her hesitation to fully accept him as her father adds a layer of authenticity to her trust. It unfolds in fleeting instances, where he finds himself beside her at breakfast, savoring her pancakes, instinctively reaching for his hand with a sense of ease. The most poignant moment occurs when she willingly settles onto his lap, leaning against him as if she has finally found someone she can trust. That solitary action holds greater significance than any words could convey. Clara's role holds significant importance as well. She transcends the role of a mere love interest; she embodies a mother, fiercely devoted to safeguarding her child's well-being. Her hesitation stems not from malice, but from a long history of doubt. She must recognize that Edward is genuinely committed to remaining by her side, that he won't abandon her when challenges arise. When she finally challenges him to prove himself, she is offering him the chance to become the father Lily truly deserves, rather than deciding that fate for him. The sense of fulfillment in this ending arises from its deliberate pacing, avoiding a hasty move towards a flawless resolution. Edward doesn't resolve all issues instantly, and the narrative doesn't wrap up with an improbable happy ending. Rather, it concludes with the assurance of authenticity, a father finally taking responsibility, a mother starting to regain her trust, and a young girl discovering that love can exist without strings attached. This tale unfolds around the theme of second chances, the quest to reclaim lost moments, and the understanding that family transcends mere blood ties. It's about presence, commitment, and the choice to love, even in the face of challenges. Ultimately, Edward discovers not merely a daughter, but something infinitely more precious. He discovers a meaning that no level of riches or achievement could ever substitute.